Why are oil lawyers trying to overturn tribal sovereignty? It's an interesting question, right? Because Gibson Dunn are the same law firm that represented Chevron in their case against indigenous people in Ecuador, the same people who got Stephen Donziger thrown in jail. Interesting.
Hello.
Well, hello, Rabbit. Welcome in. Thank you so much for joining me here, taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me. What we wanted to talk about today was obviously you've been following ICWA, you've been following the Supreme Court case challenging it, which has been brought by one of the most notorious law firms of all time, Gibson Dunn. So let's start with like the first question, right? Like, what is ICWA? How did it come to be? And what's going on with this challenge? Because you have been listening to the Supreme Court oral arguments, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but from what I've gathered, they're absolutely unhinged.
Yeah, it's dark, and I want to preface this by saying the Supreme Court as a creature is its own little culture.
It is.
Like
It's
for your chat to like get some perspective on the Supreme Court, even if you're a licensed attorney, you still are not necessarily permitted to testify in front of the Supreme Court. It's its own beast.
Yep.
And there are specific lawyers who only talk to the Supreme Court, and they don't care about fingerprints. They don't care about witnesses. They care about the philosophy of law.
Yep.
So that's what they're debating. And it is exceedingly
Hypotheticals.
Oh yeah, and it's exceedingly boring.
Mhm.
And like if you listen to the testimony from the ICWA hearing, it's 3.5 hours long. And it
Mhm.
is just one guy after another talking, and them asking random questions about stuff you've never heard of.
Yeah.
There was one point where one of the guys who was testifying, they started debating the premise of the 42nd letter of the Federalist Papers in order to determine the intent
Right.
of the
Yes.
Constitution relative
Yes.
to the Articles of Confederation.
Mhm.
And that was like a sticking point on, okay, how do we understand this law relative to the Articles of Confederation?
Right.
Like, okay.
No, that's
So
that's a bit more in the weeds than a lot of Supreme Court arguments. I am someone who's a bit of a freak, and despite not being a lawyer or law student, I have listened to many oral arguments and read through amicus briefs for various cases. That's even more in the weeds than some of the stuff I've seen, but that's kind of the game, right? Is that it's all about like absurd wordplay, and a lot of the time the Supreme Court is going to rule on basically whatever their ideological predisposition is, as long as there is a way to ex post facto justify it with some precedent. Now, they won't always do that. I mean, look at the overturning of Roe, right? There's a lot of precedent that they overturn. For example, there's something called stare decisis, which basically means if something's been a law for a long time, even if it's wrong, it has to be maintained unless it's like egregiously wrong. And I mean, this has been around not as long as Roe, but ICWA has been, the law of the land for, well,
yeah, 40 years.
40
It's
years
been,
or so, right?
yeah.
And the thing with ICWA is, we'll get into this a little bit in a minute, but ostensibly this is about adoption practices for indigenous children, right? Ostensibly this is limited in scope, and most of these cases, the Supreme Court, when they rule, especially like with decisions that could be very big, they try to normally take as narrow a scope as possible. But the way this case is going to be argued, its implications seem to be extremely far reaching, whether or not the court and the plaintiff's attorneys say it's supposed to be. So let's start with, what's ICWA, Rabbit? Could you explain a little bit about what ICWA is?
Well, and they're trying to do a narrow interpretation of a law that covers a lot of scope
Yeah.
for this reason. It is fundamentally the issue of colonialist United States policy relative to all Native Americans. So that your audience is aware, this is the way this breaks down. In the United States, there is one group of people that is still subject to what is called the blood law, meaning you are determined to be a descendant of this group and this group exclusively, and you are actually categorized based on that.
Right.
When you are registered with the federal government in the US as a Native American, you get a card. It looks like a driver's license. It has a photo, it has your name, it has your date of birth, and all of that. And it is called a CDIB, which is a Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. That's what that stands for. So when they try to
Mouthful.
introduce this, yeah. So when they try to say that this is about race, it is not. It is about independent sovereign nations
Right.
that are trying to negotiate a treaty with the United States federal government.
Right. And we're going to get into that in a second.
Right.
Because that's where this gets really important, is what you're talking about there. But to take a broader scope, what is ICWA supposed to do? What's it about?
Well, and that's what leads into,
Right.
for centuries, the US's policy toward Native Americans was either kill them or incorporate them into the local population. They cannot exist as standalone entities. We have a problem with this. So they did several different things. Sometimes they would just go to war. Sometimes they would institute things like the boarding school policy, which is, we are basically going to kidnap you people and stick you in a building somewhere and force you to become Americans. One of the policies that they had in place for over 100 years was the adoption out policy, meaning you take a Native child, you put them in an adoption agency, that adoption agency adopts them out to a white family. Yes.
Preferably Christian.
Hopefully. Optimistically. Anyway, this was done in Hawaii. This was done in Canada. This was done in Mexico. This was done in the Caribbean. This was done all over the Americas. So it's not exclusive to the US, but we're talking about US law right now.
Right.
That policy, that adoption out policy, was corrected, let's put that in air quotes, by passing the Indian Child Welfare Act.
ICWA.
And that was passed in ICWA. We all call it ICWA because Indian Child Welfare Act takes a long time. That was passed in 1978. In 78, the United States Congress said, you can't do this anymore. And it created a three-pronged test.
Right.
Either the parents of the child, then you go to the extended family of the child, and then you go to the tribe of the child. That's all prong numbers 1 and 2. Third prong is adjacent Native American group. So you could have someone like a Creek child getting adopted into a Cherokee family, but they all live in Oklahoma and they live right next door to each other.
Right.
So this was not considered a problem. The case that's being brought, and this is where the influence is a kid who is Navajo, who was brought into an adoption agency in Texas and fostered into a white family. Now, for those of you who can read a map, Texas and Navajo territory are not the same thing. Texas is claiming, no, we have the right to do this. This is fine. We don't like ICWA. It's a problem. That's annoying to us. So that's what this case is about.
Is them just trying to overturn that. And this is one of those cases where you've had certain right-wing groups for a while gunning for the case. And what we have going on right now is they have waited for, the perfect families for them to use as plaintiffs to take this to the Supreme Court, now that they have a friendly Supreme Court. And
there was a previous case. This came up a few years ago. It was called the Baby Veronica case.
Right.
And the Baby Veronica case actually had similar characteristics to this one. The details are different, but it was a parent who was essentially absent for an extended period of time. Grandparents were temporarily the custodians, but the kid ended up in foster care. So there were a lot of similar points. In the Baby Veronica case, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Veronica adoption was valid. They didn't say why.
They just said it was.
Yes, they didn't give a justification. They did not give a legal precedent establishing why Veronica should be an exemption for ICWA. And natives at the time, were saying, oh shit, they just opened the door.
Yeah.
We don't know what the exemptions are, which means we don't know what next kid is going to come along that they'll be fine with. Well,
Yep.
now we have our answer.
Yep, this. And this case is, tailored to try and destroy ICWA as a whole. So, getting into some of the arguments, right? Kind of the central point that's being made in extremely bad faith, of course, by the Gibson Dunn lawyers is that, well, this is actually discriminatory against Indigenous people. So it's actually an anti-Indigenous law that is hurting Indigenous children because, in every other situation, because you can't make considerations in law based off race, right? So in every other situation, kids are placed, based off of their, where they'll thrive the most or whatever, arbitrary means they use. But in this case, there are different rules, like we just said, the three-pronged test for how placements work for foster care or adoption or whatever related to Indigenous children. So the argument that they are making is, well, actually, this is hurting Indigenous children because it's not preferencing the best interest of the kids. It's instead preferencing the interest of the tribe over the child. And this is an unacceptable race-based exception to normal adoption procedures, which means it's, it can't stand, right? Because it's a race-based law. Which is where we get into the really hairy stuff with this, because according to US law, like you were saying, it's a sovereign political entity. Tribes are sovereign political entities. It's not a racial category. So what would happen if the Supreme Court upholds the plaintiffs on this and says, yeah, actually, this ICWA was a race-based discriminatory law?
Okay, do you mean if they strike down ICWA?
Correct. Right, based off the grounds that ICWA is racially motivated.
Then Indigenous sovereignty itself is questioned.
Right.
In other words, so imagine sort of what your audience would need to know in order to get this image in your head correctly. Imagine if England was located in the middle of Kansas.
Right.
England is a completely foreign country, and we have already agreed by way of our constitution, by way of our voting system and our representative system, all of that, we have all collectively agreed the federal government deals with foreign governments. You can't have the state of Kansas negotiating with, say, Poland on behalf of the US. That's ridiculous.
It doesn't. You're not allowed to do that.
Yeah. But what's happening in this case is an independent adoption agency is negotiating with a foreign power.
Yes.
And so the federal government is essentially saying, no, you can't do that. What do you think you're doing? And the adoption agency is saying, they're Indians. They're not real people. So if they strike down ICWA on their argument, then they are essentially saying Native nations don't exist. They don't have the right to determine who their children are and where their children live. That's not okay.
Basically, they are going to completely undermine the entirety of the premise of Indigenous sovereignty for these regions.
Yeah,
it opens the door for all of that, right? And
yeah, they're trying to backdoor sovereign territory.
Right, exactly. And obviously, we all know the argument he's making here is extremely bad faith. He's doing a hue and cry before the cameras, like, oh, I just care about the children. These children are getting placed in bad homes. They're going to have bad outcomes, when he's working for Gibson Dunn. And who is Gibson Dunn?
Funny you should ask that. Gibson Dunn is one of the primary representatives for the company that was installing the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Oh, you don't say.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
That is weird.
Gibson Dunn works for energy companies.
No.
Now, here's some more fun fact for you. You may have noticed. I just said this was a Navajo kid. The Navajo lands have some of the richest deposits of nuclear fissile material. As a matter of fact, poisoning from radioactivity and mining has been an ongoing issue in Navajo country for decades. Which, it's weird. The companies that do all of this mining, they're supposed to clean up after themselves. But
Do they
If it's
not?
not Navajo territory anymore, if it's
Mhm.
just random land out in the middle of nowhere, well, then
Uh-huh.
that's not their problem, is it?
No. Why would it be their problem?
Yeah.
My God. And looking at some of the cases, right, Gibson Dunn has done, and this is, let's just say they have a storied history of fucking with indigenous people.
Yeah. There is another important component to consider,
Hmm.
which is in front of the cameras, they are making a big show of the Burkine family being very
Hmm.
loving and being very caring. And that may or may not be true. I am not even going to comment on that part. What I will say is standing in front of the Supreme Court justices, the very first argument that the second testifying party made
Uh-huh.
was, Your Honors, do you understand how much money it would cost the state of Texas to enforce ICWA? That's an unnecessary financial burden. I mean, we'd have to actually check to see if all of the kids in our system are native.
Oh, no.
He
Oh, that'd be...
literally said that out loud. Out loud in front of 9 justices of the Supreme Court. He said, We're not checking yet.
Huh.
That's what he said.
That doesn't seem great. Seems like they might be lying a little bit. So let's look at some of their notable cases here. The firm is representing Chevron in its long-running $27 billion environmental dispute with Ecuador. I wonder who's they're disputing with in Ecuador. According to The Intercept, Gibson Dunn has hired private investigators to track Steven Donziger, who was the lawyer who won the biggest environmental judgment in history of $27 billion against Chevron for poisoning the indigenous people of Ecuador by dumping waste, and created a, quote, team of hundreds of lawyers to fight him. This resulted in a boycott launched April 2021 by the student group, Students for Climate Accountability. The firm represented George W. Bush in Bush v. Gore, contesting the certification of the Florida's election results in 2000. Interesting. And they went on, the person who did so, who argued for Bush, went on to be Solicitor General for the Bush admin. Let's see. Interesting. They defended Intel against several multi-billion antitrust lawsuits filed by AMD and the European Union. Remember, Intel did a lot of trust violations back in the day. Interesting. They represented the Dole Food Company in a multi-billion toxic tort suit in Nicaragua involving allegations of farm worker sterility stemming from Dole's use of certain pesticides. After the firm uncovered substantial evidence of fraud and conspiracy between the plaintiffs and Nicaraguan judges to extort Dole with manufactured claims, the courts dismissed them in the United States. I'm going to have to see a big citation on that, because that's the same thing they claimed in Ecuador, that the judges were colluding with the indigenous people to extort Chevron out of their hard-earned money.
Well, and it's worth pointing out,
Uh-huh.
for those of you who know the other streamer that has been covering Hawaiian issues,
Uh-huh.
Silverspook,
Mm-hmm.
he's been talking a lot about adoption agencies and the process of the federal government basically invading his homeland
Yeah.
and taking over the kingdom. One point that he makes repeatedly is Dole Corporation just took over several islands
Yeah.
and
No, straight up.
forced the indigenous population to work there and literally claimed the children as property. So this
Mm-hmm.
has precedent not just, on the contiguous 48. This is all of the United States dealing with indigenous populations.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's worth noting Hawaii was literally just stolen. The United States just steals Hawaii. Let's also not forget Texas has been a major hotspot for a medical kidnap, often adopting non-white children exclusively into white families looking for designer adoption experiences. Right. And another interesting note here, they are representing the plaintiffs in Holland v. Bracken that we were talking about. But guess what? So this is what's really interesting here, because this is a designer lawsuit, right? This is a designer SCOTUS case, meaning that powerful right-wing groups have been searching for plaintiffs to overturn ICWA. And I think we're starting to get an understanding of why they would want to overturn ICWA. Because if tribal sovereignty is cast into doubt, not only can they reignite cultural genocide, but tribal lands will now be just U.S. lands, and they will be open to exploitation and just being given for free to the companies that want the resources that rightfully belong to the tribes, such as building pipelines or stealing uranium or mining and poisoning everyone. Whatever the fuck they want to do. I mean, look what they could do when tribes have sovereignty. So an interesting note here is that they're representing, this is a case that makes, or a firm that makes billions of dollars, representing the largest corporations on earth in literal demon lawsuits. But out of the kindness of their heart, they just really care about this family tale. They just think they're really good for this child to be adopted into, so they're representing them pro bono. Judging by how much this firm charges, I'm guessing that's probably several $1 million worth of pro bono fees. How kind of them to do that.
I think it's worth considering as well that we are talking about fundamentalist Christian families.
Oh, yeah.
The Heritage Foundation is not a non-entity in this. I'm not trying to draw any sort of conspiratorial lines here.
Well,
I'm saying that as a voting bloc, we are talking about a very particular set of interests. And I mean, Texas voters, they love the idea of Texas basically sticking it to the man, so to speak. So there's also that incentive when it comes to making arguments about whether or not they are subject to federal law. There's a lot, as far as the culture that is feeding into this particular lawsuit, there's a lot going on that side. But there is also a lot going on the legal sovereignty issues side. And both of those, by the way, the justices are not immune to that. When they were making their arguments, when Dunn was making their arguments, one of the issues that got brought up multiple times by the justices was, what are your feelings on the kidnapping charges as activated through The Hague? Now, for your audience, again,
excuse me? What?
Yeah, let's be clear.
What?
So the Hague, the International Criminal Court, exists because of the Nazis, and the premise was we are dealing with such a huge criminal issue that we need to get multiple nations involved in this prosecution. We can't have one country do it all. So here's this oil company who is saying the federal government has no business treating natives like they are foreign powers. And one of the justices responds, okay, well then let me ask you, what do you think about kidnapping as processed through The Hague? Do you think that's a problem? So the justices know that this is an issue about international sovereignty. They are well aware of that fact, and they are addressing it directly, and Dunn is dodging the question.
Of course they are. And unfortunately, though, the justices we have on the court right now, hey, Rabbit, you mentioned the Federalist Society. Would you know how many judges on the Supreme Court right now are members of the Federalist Society?
That is a non-zero number.
I believe it is 5 out of 9.
Correct. Yeah. So here's where it gets into the weeds on SCOTUS as a culture, and why I would actually like to hear the guy that you know who does SCOTUS. I'd like to hear the thoughts on this, because this is where I get stuck. So for example, Neil Gorsuch. Gorsuch was a political appointee through and through. Everybody had a problem with this conservative guy getting put up, but for some reason, he's really good on native sovereignty. I don't know why. I don't have the information. I don't have enough experience with the SCOTUS justices themselves to know why that's a thing.
I would, if I were to guess on Gorsuch, I would guess he's one of the rare sort of ideologically consistent right wingers, because he's been surprisingly normal on several issues in the past. If I were to guess, it would be he feels like he's one of those people who is a libertarian who's consistent, but I don't know what's going on the inside of his mind, where we have someone like Amy Coney Barrett, who's very easy to read, right? She's a religious fundamentalist, and she will rule on, she will basically rule whatever way you would expect a religious fundamentalist to rule on. Basically whatever the most evil way that you could rule on a case, she will rule on it. Now there was one case actually, which was one of the funniest cases I've ever seen. where Amy Comey Barrett was also one of the people who was sane in the case, and it was truly weird. So do you know Neil Katyal? Do you know who that is?
I've heard that name before, but it's not
So
ringing a bell.
he's a big shoe liberal lawyer, white shoe liberal lawyer. He was on the short list for the Obama admin to be attorney general, and
Okay.
he didn't get that position. I think he was also on. No, he might have been on a short list for the Supreme Court. Actually, now I'm trying to remember. But so he represents Nestle in a case, basically arguing that slaves who belong to the Nestle Corporation, the Nestle Corporation's literal human slaves in Africa who produce their products for them, cannot sue Nestle for being made slaves in the United States. And that was a real case. And Neil Katyal argued for Nestle. It was like the Alien Torts and Liabilities Act from like 1787. Basically, there's an old law that would allow foreign nationals who are victimized by U.S. citizens to sue in torts, right? To file civil lawsuits.
Right.
And that's what it was. And Neil Katyal, I can't remember his arguments, but basically he's just arguing before the Supreme Court, you know what? Under this law, slaves can't actually sue. Like, he tried to split the hair and be like, because the guy was a slave, he can't sue. Even Amy Comey Barrett was unconvinced on that one. When I was listening to the oral argument, she was like, are you sure about that? And that's pretty much the only time. There's like 2 cases I've ever seen Amy Comey Barrett not immediately take the most evil position possible. So it seems there might even be lines for her. But
Well, and that's why I say I would love to actually talk to a SCOTUS specialist,
yeah,
because like
same.
me saying, okay, they got into the weeds on letter 42 of the Federalist Papers. The reason they were doing that was because when Congress issues a law, they have the option of including with that law the intent of the law. They can
Correct.
actually put a preemptive paragraph in there saying, here's why we did this. And when it came to ICWA specifically, they had a statement of intent, and that statement of intent draws out, if you try to reduce the population of a sovereign nation, that is essentially an act of war.
Right.
So this is a genocide. We are acknowledging that this was a genocide. Boarding schools, bad. We're not doing that anymore. The intent of this law is to butt up against that old policy. So
Right.
the Supreme Court is saying, okay, can they make a statement like that? Can they actually say that these are sovereign nations? And so they're going to the Constitution. In the Constitution, Native Americans are sovereign foreign powers.
Yeah.
The very first, what eventually became the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was originally under the Secretary of War because it was a foreign sovereign power.
Yes, that we were at war with.
Yes. So
right.
to the very foundations of the country itself, they are acknowledged as foreign entities.
Right.
And this ICWA, by saying ICWA no longer applies, that means they're not foreign entities anymore. And by the way, Dunn made that argument in his rebuttal, the final rebuttal at the end of the testimony. He stood up and he genuinely said out of his face, that child was a citizen of Texas in the womb. It wasn't an Indian until it was certified after it was born. What? Texas called dibs on a kid? I mean, he's literally said,
yeah, that's what he's saying.
We own your children. We own your children. That's what he said. That's the basis of their claim.
The state owns your children, and when they're born, they may deign to return the child to you.
Yeah, we may let you see. Thank you for carrying our child in your womb. We may let you see them one day.
Right. Right. And here's the thing, though. Like, Dunn, you're right, Falcon. Dunn is playing with fire here. Like, but the cases that are coming before the Supreme Court over the next year and a half, next 2 years, are all extremely earth-shattering. We have laws that would basically upend the entire U.S. electoral system. Basically, as it stands right now, state legislatures cannot unilaterally decide state election rules. right?
Yeah.
And there's good reason for that. Because what do you think would fucking happen with state election rules if you had a bunch of insane assholes, right-wing assholes, deciding all the rules? So as it stands right now, state Supreme Courts and other bodies can intervene and say, nope, you can't do that. That's a violation of the Civil Rights Act, although the Civil Rights Act has been dramatically weakened by the court as well. You can't do that. So that's up before the court. It's very likely that they'll give state legislatures carte blanche to do whatever they want with elections. They've already dramatically struck down the ability of executive agencies such as the EPA to enforce mandates by saying they have to be specifically authorized. Like each part of the mandate has to be specifically authorized by Congress, e.g., the Drug Enforcement Agency, right? If, say, I don't know, there's a new version of fentanyl that shows up and they want to regulate it. They can no longer classify normally without a act of Congress saying they now have delegated the power to enforce this. And they're going even further, that they're considering taking a case that would completely, if they rule on it the way they're considering, completely remove the ability of Congress to delegate executive power or delegate legislative power to executive agencies. Basically meaning SEC, IRS, FBI as well, probably wouldn't be able to really enforce laws much anymore.
It bespeaks a trend in
Yes.
the types of lawsuits, not only that are being brought, because frankly, tons of lawsuits are
always
brought constantly.
shit like this is always brought. This has been brought
Right.
forever. It's
that they're accepting them.
Yes.
They are
right,
they are
that they're
willing
being
to hear
accepted.
the cases.
Right.
And I'm even a little bit lost as far as culture of SCOTUS goes. I'm even a little lost on the types of questions that the justices were asking in response to the positions that were being asserted. For example, Sotomayor, she is from Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is not a state. It is a protectorate of the United States government. Constitutionally, it's a territory. So it is already under what's collectively a series of cases that says that they are essentially a child nation relative to the parent nation of the US. So she's already been subject to this law as a child. I don't know if that's going to influence the way she reads their testimony, or if it's going to influence the way she reads the statute. I can't speak to that. I don't know, because I'm not familiar enough with the individual justices. But the questions she was asking were very much in favor of ICWA and very aggressive at the Dunn testimony. So I don't know. I hope that that's true. I hope that she is someone who's saying, no, you can't treat people like this.
Well, Sotomayor is absolutely going to rule in favor of ICWA.
I certainly hope so.
No, there's no question. There's no question. For what I know about her, there's no way she would rule against it. I think what's going to happen is obviously, like usually, all the liberal justices are going to rule in favor of ICWA. And then it's going to come down to whether a couple of the conservative justices decide to not be monsters. Now, I expect on this case, Roberts will probably side with the liberal justices. Roberts probably will on this one. And maybe Gorsuch. So, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. The follow-up to this, this is like the call to action for your chat and all of that. I've already had some people saying, okay, so what can we do?
Sure, that's the next question.
A big point to make at this juncture is there's nothing you can do, because ICWA is already in front of the Supreme Court. That it's too late. What you should be doing instead, natives have been talking about this for months. We knew the second the Supreme Court was willing to hear the case that this was a problem, because we already knew about the Baby Veronica case. So start making contact. If you see someone who is tweeting about #ICWA, start following them, see what they're discussing. Because I will tell you, half the time, and I'm assuming Falcon can agree with this, half the time we're jokey as shit. But when something important has hit, everybody is talking about it. So start following those communities, and then you'll know what it is that we're trying to get people to pay attention to, because this was ignored. It's still not in the mainstream media to any major extent.
Not really.
Yeah, Lakota Man is not a good source. Also, the also Native American N8V. Oh, that account. But yeah, don't go to Lakota Man. He'll give you a sacred name or something. I don't know. But start paying attention to the people that are actually talking about stuff that's going on right now, and then you will have people who will be talking about what's going on next.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of extremely well-educated and well-informed in our population who have been discussing this for quite some time. And it's frankly a little shocking that a lot of people who are on the sort of broader left have been paying attention to issues like Ukraine. I mean, that's fine. Have an opinion on the Ukraine, but be aware what's going on in Ukraine. You've got a miniature version of that going on across the street.
Yeah.
That's the bigger issue. So this, to me, what's happening at the Supreme Court today is an illustration of a failure of the left collectively to be aware of what's going on in its own backyard. Because these people have been making moves for decades. The Christian Coalition did not show up last week.
No.
They have been moving since the 80s. We have to be able to present a unified front against them continuing to impact our daily lives against our wishes.
Yeah. I mean, these people will really stop at nothing, honestly. And part of this is like one of the strategies that kind of the Supreme Court has taken in combination with the fact that these kind of issues, Indigenous issues, get almost no coverage whatsoever in the mainstream media, like almost none whatsoever. Supreme Court's been taking the tact of doing so many fucked up things at once that it is very difficult to keep track of all of them.
It is, and they're doing it. It's actually it's a technique. It's called sandbagging.
Yep.
Where you just throw so much at one person that they just get overwhelmed. And it's been going on for a while. But there are very deliberate moves being made, and I think part of the issue is people aren't really addressing that this is an ongoing cultural genocide. It's not something that like stopped. You know, we can sort of flatter ourselves that the law got passed in 78 and so now everything is good. No, it's not, because here's this case. It's happening literally today. So we have a demonstration of the fact that it's not in the past. And there are people that are still alive who were subject to the old system before ICWA was in place. Like if you're older than 40, there's a chance that you were involved in these adopt-out policies.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, the word, and this is something I really harp on, it's been my little tub to thump for 20 years now, transracial. The term transracial got appropriated by the left in order to make fun of Rachel Dolezal because they thought that they were calling attention to racism. No, transracialism was a term that was invented by Blacks and Natives to talk about being adopted out. And the experience of growing up. Yeah, the experience of growing up in a white family. It was invented by Black sociologists. And they were addressing what it was like to be adopted into a white family and not having a cultural tie to Black identity.
Right.
And then it got stolen by supposed leftists in order to like make fun of Rachel Dolezal. This sort of hegemonic
I did not
whiteness.
know that.
Yeah, hegemonic whiteness is still a factor. And the left needs to be aware of that fact in its own midst. And that's, I hope that this case will illustrate that and people will start to broaden their horizons and start to
really hope so.
Yeah, that's my ideal formation. But as far as the issues today, as far as what the testimony was about, I know what they're saying in front of the cameras, and we can feel as sympathetic as we want for the families themselves that are involved. But
they can go fuck themselves. I don't have any sympathy for them.
Even so, the Dunn testimony was, this is, if we enforce this, it'll cost us money. How dare you? And oh, by the way, these children are ours to do with as we please.
Right.
That was their testimony. So do not pay any attention to do not brook any exceptions to this and hear that it's about race.
Yep.
or hear that it's about families. No, it's not. They
It's not.
stated it's about money and power, and that's
Yep.
it.
Yeah, and them claiming the whole, oh, it's about families or whatever, that's obviously a misdirection. It's obviously a misdirection. They are if this was about families, Gibson Dunn would not be representing this case fucking pro bono. Are you serious? Literally, just imagine, like, this family's like, oh boy, I sure wish we could keep this Indigenous child we stole. And then there's a puff of smoke and brimstone, and the devil appears, and as soon as like, oh, you'd like to keep this child. If only ICWA was overturned. My name is Gibson Dunn. Here's my card. Give me a call. I'd be happy to help. I love seeing a happy family.
And they're even playing this, they're giving a Solomon's bargain to Native Americans, because what they're essentially saying is, you hate this child. You're torturing this child. You're ripping them from their family, the only family they've ever known.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in that double bind.
Yep.
Okay, we have to talk about sovereignty, but we can't just like throw this kid out the window and say, okay, but with that one person, we're not going to talk about love, and we're not going to talk about community and support, because we're focusing on the bigger issue.
Right.
And so we're trapped on that part. We can't make that argument. This is where the allies come in. We need allies making that argument of, no, we see through this. We see what you're doing.
Yeah.
This is bullshit. And you're using a child
As
literally as a prop.
Yep.
Yeah. It's you're puppeting this child in order to hang over the head of entire sovereign nations. We see you. That's what we need, but that's not what we're getting. What we're getting is, here's a loving family who's raising this brown child. Aren't they sweet?
Yeah, I mean, there's like it drives me crazy. There's only so much you can scream that too, right? Like, it's crazy to me that anyone would take this bait at all and believe these lines for even a half second. But
But here we are. Yeah,
but
Falcon.
here we are.
That's a good point. The Elian Gonzalez moment. It's
Yep.
a kid who's crying. So pay attention to the kid who's crying, and pay no attention to anything else that happened.
Right, and like, man, but what I'd say though, like, what?
Okay, I gotta dip out. I gotta go. Sorry.
All right, no, you're fine. But thank you so much for coming on. This is a very important issue, and more people need to be talking about it. So thank you for coming on and discussing this with me. Please
Absolutely.
keep in contact. We'll probably have you come back on and discuss this in the near future. But yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Take care. Bye. But yeah, what I was going to say, though, is that what strikes me is how fucking selfish and callous this family is. Like, yes, I know they probably love this kid or whatever, or like, they care about the kid's welfare or whatever. But if they can't see, like, look at what the consequences of their actions would be, and that doesn't give them pause, my God. Absolutely hopeless. Like, I just, like, it blows my mind. Really. Oh, God. The Save the Children crowd strikes again. It's disgusting. It's extremely bad faith. And I just don't understand. Like, I guess these people are either awful people themselves, or they are so short-sighted and blinded by their own desires that they are missing what the consequences of their actions will be. They love to shove crying kids in your face and call you a terrible person even when they're the reason the kid is crying. Yup. Just really sick shit. Really sick shit. This is some really sick people. Simply, don't do that. But, like, the way these people are behaving truly beggars belief that they are just willing to let themselves be used in a case like this to overturn the rights of a huge group of people who are going to be who have historically been subject to genocide and ongoing genocide by the government.